If you're watching Toronto real estate right now, don't start with interest rates. Start with rents. Rents are where urgency shows up first. Urgency is what held the last cycle together. When the rent surge hits its ceiling, the reset starts quietly, then shows up everywhere else. I'm Jordan, and as always, thanks for joining me on today's episode of the podcast. We're going to be talking about the rental market and how it's been softening in 2026 so far, and what that means for the rest of the overall housing market. So I just put out a newsletter on this morning, but the average rent in Toronto is at about $2,500 for an average unit. That's down approximately 5% year over year. And within the last 2 years, that's down 12%. Now, I started doing rentals when I started my career as an agent over 9 years ago in the city. I've done over 300 rentals at this point, so it's been quite a lot. I've seen most of what's out there. I've seen almost every condo building in the city at this point, except for some of the brand new ones. In addition to rents being down, a normal thing that goes along with that is rental listings sitting for longer. So just like in the housing market with purchases and sales, those listings are sitting for an average of about 2 months now. In the rental market, we're also seeing units sitting for longer. This is normal. Generally, the housing market, the sale prices tend to be affected slower than the rental market. Usually the rental market's affected first. I'm sure you've heard the term a lot that housing is a lagging indicator, so it does take some time for the actual sale prices of homes to catch up with what's really going on in the overall economy, and even in the rental market. So another thing that generally accompanies rental units sitting for longer and tenants having more time to make decisions is incentives for renting out units. So if you've been paying attention to the rental market in the last couple of years, you'll know that purpose-built rentals are popping up all over the city. These are buildings that are built specifically just to be rented out. You can't own them. The city and province were offering a lot of incentives to developers and are still offering them. Even the recent Bill 60 added some more incentives to developers for purpose-built rentals. So getting back to the incentives, these purpose-built rentals a lot of times have been offering up to 1, even 2 months free rent when you do a year-long lease term. So that's something that as an agent, I've never really seen except in these purpose-built rentals. The idea is they get launched and they have a ton of vacant units, much like a new condo development. And they just want to fill those units as quickly as they can because, other than a tenant that is destroying the place and not paying rent, the other worst thing you can have as a landlord is an empty unit that's just sitting there, you're paying for it, and the bills are racking up. We hit what I think is or was an affordability ceiling. And what I think that means is rents were running way ahead of incomes. So there's been a well-known rule of thumb that you want to have your rent only take up about 30% of your gross income. If you've rented in Toronto over the last decade, maybe even a little longer, you know that that's not really a possibility. A lot of times, especially when you're starting out, you got a new job in the city, your rent's going to take up 50%, sometimes more of your gross income. So that's just a reality people were living with. This led to people very often finding places with roommates or just staying in rent-controlled units for a lot longer. Just a quick aside, rent-controlled units just means that the owner can only increase the rent by a certain percentage. I believe this year it's 2.5%. It was 1.2% not that long ago, so that has increased. And one exception is in November 2018, the province introduced the lack of rent control on units that were built after that time. So that also did affect this a little bit. We had landlords really trying to get rid of tenants in some cases so that they could just jack up the rents to whatever the market would allow. So yeah, people were moving in with roommates. They were staying put in maybe less than ideal units just because they were rent controlled. And that's kind of a symptom of the rental market being really overpriced compared to what people could actually afford in the city. So when that started to change, when we saw all these new developments finishing, a lot of them around the same time, all these purpose-built rentals popping up, and they're all kind of competing for that same pool of tenants. And this is just within the last 2 years, I would say, since 2024. That's when we start seeing this cooling period happen. And it's basic supply and demand. When there's a lot more supply than there is demand, we're going to see the prices drop like they have. And we're going to see the incentives coming in for tenants to rent out units and more choice and more options for those tenants with rental units. That's not to say, of course, that demand isn't still there. There's still a lot of people moving to Toronto. And for well-built, very livable rental units, you're always going to see a high demand, especially if they're in a good location of the city. But kind of like I was talking about on my last episode with the condo market correction, a bit of a problem with all those terrible bachelor and one-bedroom units that are so small and unlivable is they did add to this influx of units available. And so those units become even worse and even less desirable. It does mean that people moving from those units are going to be competing for some of these better units at the same time. So those units shouldn't really have too much of an issue renting out. Say a well laid out 800, 900 square foot 2-bedroom unit with proper doors, no sliding doors, things like that. You know, a good balcony, good location, parking. Those things are still going to rent out no problem. Where investors and landlords are having big issues are those tiny bachelor units, the 1-bedroom units, trying to rent them out for, you know, $2,300, $2,400 for a tiny junior 1-bedroom. That ship has kind of sailed, at least for the time being. And we have hit a lower mark here. Now we're down about 12%, but if you were in the city like I was during COVID, we actually had a way crazier situation happen where I actually rented out a bachelor unit. This is the lowest I've ever rented out a condo to someone before, but it was a bachelor condo near the Eden Center at $1,200 a month, which is really not something I ever thought would happen. I used to rent out bachelor units really regularly for $1,800, $1,900, $1,700. During COVID, there were a ton of them in the $1,500 mark, $1,400. So, you know, since COVID, this is definitely the biggest rental drop that we've seen. Another side effect of so many rentals being available and the rental market softening is that the purchasing market will also soften a bit. Something that does put some pressure on the buying market is people coming up against their rentals, being kicked out, being priced out, and even just comparing that, you know, if you're paying $3,000 a month for a 2-bedroom rental and you're living with your partner, well, in the past, especially when rates were down to 1% or, you know, 1.5%, a lot of times you could get a mortgage that wasn't even that much more expensive than your rental was. So this softening of the market obviously does a little bit of myth busting for us. So I just want to go over a couple things I've heard over the years. One is that rental prices just go up and up forever. Obviously, that's not the case. We've seen, especially during COVID, a huge rent price decrease when everyone was leaving the city. We've seen in the last 2 years another rent price decrease, 12% in the last 2 years. So if you're someone who feels like the rental market is really unfair and only ever goes up, I don't disagree with you that it can feel unfair, and it's still expensive even though it's been going down, don't get me wrong. But the market's clearly showing us that it doesn't just go up forever, just like with the sale market. Now, while I would call the condo market, what's happened there with the condo sale market, a crash, I wouldn't necessarily call this rental market a crash. 12% in 2 years is more of a softening than a full-out market crash. If you're thinking about buying or selling this year, the rental market softening is one of those second-order shifts that can quietly change negotiations. So reach out to me at 416-908-6124 or in the video links in the description or podcast notes, and I'd be happy to walk you through a way to navigate this market without making a pretty costly mistake. It is a pretty tricky market at the moment. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe, and leave any questions you have in the comments below.